I'm super honored to be joining here with some esteemed friends and co-investors along this great investor panel here. My name is Chris Leiter. I am currently a digital health and bio investor and investor in the DeSci space. We're going to do a quick round of intros and we're going to dive into what we're looking at in terms of DeSci investment theses and thinking about how, as investors, we're thinking about building a longevity of the community of founders and companies in this space. So to my left, I have Patrick Malone from North Pond Ventures, which is a $2.1 billion AUM fund based in DC, Boston, and SF. You guys invest in biotech and healthcare. Honored to have Madej here from 50 years, back in pre-seed and seed investments in the deep tech space and solving intractable problems in our world today. And you're from SF, right, Ella? Yeah. Poland and then SF. Okay, all right. And then we have Elad from Lunar Ventures, which is a local deep tech and AI firm, building pre-seed seed ventures. And then lastly, Alex from Inflection. That was a great intro. Was that a great intro for you? I think it's good. I think it's good. Let's see if I've left. No. Okay, so I'm going to yell. Alex from Inflection VC, which is a crypto open economy fund based here, also in Berlin. So thanks again for everyone joining. So I think we want to first think about like how we all as investors, I think the exception of you, Alex, we kind of not as a native crypto investor, how have we thought about developed our way in, and what's our DeSci thesis in the space? So we'll go down the road here. So Patrick, maybe you can kind of give your thesis and how you got into this space.
Yeah, so
Just
You're going to shout. You're going to shout.
so I feel like everyone's got an interesting path to DeSci. So I did, before venture, I was a physician scientist by training, did my PhD, and kind of lived a lot of the scars that I think DeSci is trying to seeking to solve. So dealt with kind of the frustrations of scientific funding, NIH, long funding cycles, all that kind of stuff. Also had a bit of a computer science background, so I've kind of on the sidelines, just following from afar crypto for a number of years. I think maybe a year ago or so, kind of came across Molecule and beat it out, started following just on Twitter what they were doing. At some point last year, it kind of clicked that clearly there was something here. So I think I probably slid into Tyler's DMs at some point during last year. Got connected in January, I think it was this year. It was kind of a shotgun wedding. It was very much drank the Kool-Aid of what they were doing. Really liked what Molecule and Beat It Out had done. Space is early, but it was solving a real pain point, which I'm sure we'll get into. Kind of the broader thesis for me in DeSci, there's many ways you can answer this question. I think one of the more interesting ones to me, or passionate ones to me, is that herd mentality in science and venture is very real. I think it's very easy to look to the same institutions, the same projects, the same PIs for research, for scientific innovation, and those PIs get well funded, but there's a lot of interesting research going on kind of between the coasts. I think that stuff is under-discovered, underfunded, under-commercialized. And so I think DeSci has an opportunity, kind of led by Molecule, but there'll be many folks that will build in this space, to really build kind of the funding, the infrastructure, to really, I think, commercialize, de-risk, and bring to kind of ultimate patient impact in the clinic all these projects that would otherwise not get funded. So I think there's a number of ways to answer this question. For me, it's building the kind of funding and infrastructure for surfacing research, translational research that otherwise wouldn't ultimately get to the clinic.
Hi, my name is Elad. This is loud. I started my first company when I was 21. It was a software development firm doing, in the very early years of Rails as a framework. So we did Ruby on Rails and then iOS and Android development. And through that, built some developer tools, and through that, started an enterprise software company that did well and ended up being a partner in the fund, and started 50 years after this existential crisis of what are we doing, and like what are we doing this for? And it was really this realization that we should be using the power of technology, and the smartest people should be working on solving the biggest problems. So that's this very, very short way of telling the story of 50 years. And we back a lot of deep tech. companies because they happen to be needed and important. So we work with a lot of scientists. We in climate and synbio, in alternative proteins, and many other areas. And I think so. We have been close to the sort of PhD founders trying to spin out, and I think we're close to the frustrations that they have with how this process works on the sort of scientific founder side. And then the way I got back to this space, other than just being friends with a bunch of people in the Ethereum community and with those other communities, I had a baby, and then after my maternity leave last year, I went to ETH CC Paris, and it just struck me that it reminded me a lot about sort of the energy of the early days of the sort of open source developer communities that I was a part of. I used to run really large Ruby and Rails events, and so just that realization, and then also realizing that a bunch of things became possible because of the development that happened in this space. So like, and also the fact that this space is moving so fast. So I think it's realizing, and it's also just learning from the community and seeing what people are working on, and I think it's just an extremely exciting space. So we're very much here to learn and see what other people are working on.
Hey everyone, sorry for my accent, I'm Israeli. So, based in Berlin though. My girlfriend says, speak slower. So I have a confession. I don't really believe in investing in this side. I also don't believe in investing
First hot take of the day. I love this. This is great.
No, it's about my brain. I don't believe in investing in open source either. And I don't believe in investing in anything that's like community-based and where you don't know how to, where one person sells another organization and they pay money back. I don't know, very traditional. This is why we have to make way for the next generation. But it works. Out of my fund's investment, open source investments are doing the best. DeSci and decentralization is doing the best. It just works, and I still don't understand why. I don't understand why Wikipedia works either. So I think this is my journey every day into DeSci and into decentralization, and honestly into open source as well, is looking at this thing which is indistinguishable from magic, where I don't believe, my brain patterns don't believe this should work, and yet it does. And trying to figure out, the power of community is amazing, and all of us are like, oh, the power of community is creating, but well, what is that? So for me, it's just a question of how do you model the power of community, how do you understand it, how can you predict it, how can you make any theories around it, and I think if we learn that, then this side will be the only science that exists, and open source software will be the only software that exists, and I hope we get to this world as soon as possible.
Yeah.
This is amazing, Elad. You're one of the few investors who've already proven to override biases by just making investments and being right early on. What is phenomenal.
Being wrong.
Being wrong from time to time is part of the business. I actually take the opposite piece here. So I've always been a big believer in open systems and network-driven communities and technologies. I worked with Google for a while in early stage fintech. Afterwards, and have been in venture now for about 8 years. Worked with larger multi-stage funds in Berlin and London primarily, and started Inflection in early 19. And in early 19, we put out a very brief thesis on what we call the open economy. So I'm taking a little bit of a step back here to map out the grand scheme of things a little bit. So I've been particularly excited about open monetary systems in the early days, what kind of represent the nucleus of this social movement or techno-social movement that we currently see unfold. And from there, we've seen a bunch of innovations in middleware that were basically systems sitting on top of these layer ones for all kinds of purposes, and then the first applications in decentralized finance, DeFi. Now the first wave of NFT-enabled, I wouldn't even call it adoptions, maybe speculation at this point. And decentralized science is just an emergence of these patterns and of these structures into another area. And what I believe is that each of these categories, starting with open source monetary systems, open finance, open media, or open science, follow their own adoption patterns or their own adoption S-curves. And they all have their own sets of catalysts driving these technologies, and also, I would say, barriers or challenges to overcome. In DeFi, it's primarily regulation, and in other fields, there are different obstacles to overcome. And I also believe that within each of these categories, you're going to see multiple waves of innovation hitting the markets with a ton of failed experiments. And that's what we've seen in the first wave of ICOs in 2017, where the underlying models were very far from working. They were very flawed. They're still, in many cases, very flawed, or TBD, if they work on a long enough time horizon. And right now, I came here with the expectation of seeing 20 people in the basement, and now it's like fucking 10x that, and a very interesting mix of people as well, so I'm pretty much blown away. And originally I would have said, this is like 2018 DeFi or 2019 NFTs, but this conference alone might prove me wrong, so maybe we're actually accelerating from one step to the other in this ecosystem. And yeah, I don't have any a deeper thesis or so. We are typically going after alien founders that have some kind of a secret sauce. We got involved in the space through Molecule, and other than that, we try to be more, almost opportunistic if the ideas are powerful and we feel there's somebody trying to solve a gigantic problem. So other than that, I'm just staying open-minded and see what the real innovators have to say and work on.
So I'll just say a quick story from my way in. I blame Paul. I just saw Paul came in finally. So a permissioned blockchain, and that's very much we've now seen. This is very much a proof point that really the permissionless, open source, the community-based solutions are really going to be the winners in the space, and that's certainly some lessons I've learned in the space. I want to pivot a little bit to kind of thinking about, there's tons of capital, especially in deep tech and biotech, and this is a space that we all operate in. But we haven't. How do we evangelize as investors to our other biotech investors and bring them along to us inside the space? So two-part question. That is part one. But tangentially, we've been thinking about the traditional route to market is technology licensing offices and technology transfer offices inside large research institutions, and how do they come along alongside biotech VC? Patrick Northpond has a really deep, extensive network inside some major research institutions that I've seen firsthand at MIT and Stanford and a few others. How do you guys think about this and underwriting the DeSci space, TTOs, TLOs, and then biotech VCs?
Yeah, and I think to answer your first question, the space is incredibly exciting, as we've seen over the last couple of days. I think focusing on the problem is critical to motivate people to come work on it. It's obviously been incredible work done by many folks here over the last year, 2 years, many years in Paul and Tyler's case. I think now the switch that needs to be flipped, that is being flipped, is actually going to specific, there's infinite problems that can be worked on within the scientific funding commercialization space. Now, as it pertains to biotech, getting traditional biotech VCs on board, non-Web3 natives say, it's going to really be about finding specific use cases that have real solutions for these problems. So it no longer is enough to say, here's all the problems in biotech and scientific funding, for example, here's Web3, which is really interesting, therefore it's a match made in heaven. This is what I think MetaDAO has done really well, for example, just to pick one problem. Anybody that's a scientist knows that getting funding from NIH is extremely difficult, it's extremely long, it's arduous, etc. The ability of DAOs, for example, to very quickly, on the order of weeks, bootstrap up millions of dollars for funding, have a project be listed on the Molecule marketplace, for example, and basically go from proposed project to money in the bank and research being funded and performed in a few weeks is something the NIH would never be able to do. So I think there is a very specific, targeted problem statement and a solution and evidence to show that it can actually be done. I think in as much as you solicit or garner interest from biotech, showing those types of things would be critical. So focusing on problems and specific solutions. In terms of TTOs, it's a thorny issue. Anybody that's worked with technology transfer or spent time in academia knows that technology transfer has an incredibly difficult problem. It's usually a few individuals within academia tasked with a really difficult task of taking all the research within their institution and figuring out a commercialization and patent strategy for bringing this out into the real world. I think a lot of the work going forward for this community broadly will be figuring out, and some of this is going to be idiosyncratic to each TTO, but figuring out how do they work, how do their minds work, what are their incentives. So just one example, I kind of early in the space thought perhaps they would care about revenue, for example. So perhaps you can negotiate a way for near-term revenue for their ability to perhaps release IP rights. One thing that many TTOs that I've talked to care about more is brand, being the ability to essentially get their academic research at University X out into the world, impacting patients with their name attached to it. So I think in as much as DeSci, this is another thesis that I have that I know others share, can provide essentially an orthogonal channel beyond the traditional, say, sub-licensing of traditional biotech for getting academic research out into the real world. Maybe not even through traditional channels, but just a kind of another channel. I think would be highly interesting to TTOs, the ability to get their name out there, impacting patients in a way that kind of augments their existing channels instead of replacing them. But that's just one idea.
Elad, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll start with the TTOs. We're actually working on, we have this internal research project called the Spin-Out Project, essentially trying to map that out, like what incentivizes TTOs, like what levers do PhDs and then scientists who are trying to spin out have. And I mean, it's idiosyncratic. It's it's different in the US. It's different in Europe. There's like philosophical approaches that are different. But and there's those amazing cases of places like the University of Waterloo that just like do not take any IP. They're also like crypto forward. So there could be just some really great standards making that can happen in conjunction with those universities. Because when you think of, let's say, a SAFE, what it is and what it did to the startup funding market, it essentially was a standard that was imposed by essentially for the lack of a better word, deal maker in this space. And the question is, like, how do we engineer a similar situation where it can be a distributed deal maker that has the concentrated power of creating new standards that can push the standards and the new ways of doing things, and hopefully a Molecule and other organizations in the space can also enable that. Where that just essentially becomes the no-brainer way of doing things, and the best researchers would want to associate themselves with the best future researchers, the best talent, the best people will want to associate themselves only with those institutions that have this sort of most logical and most friendly way of spinning out. So yeah, we're trying to map it in the sort of the conventional sort of old school sort of part there, and then the question around adding Web3 to this, I think, really starts with we're not even really there with most institutions. We're trying to really map what drives them and how to even get them to simplify it. I don't think I have. I mean, just first question. Later stage investors, the angel, the pre-seed, and the seed, they just really want to see some early signs of product market fit and the product being somehow built. I think most investors actually, it's not like they have you don't have to advocate anything to them. They often don't really have any special master plans. They just want to see progress and they want to see usage, and that's worth more than anything else. So I think just fully agree with what you said, and it's by the time you start talking to those later stage investors, it's really just about having some traction and solving some real problems and yeah.
So how do you get traditional organizations, TTOs, investors to come along with decentralization? I don't know, does this physicists say science progresses one funeral at a time? And you see quantum mechanics. The advances always you need all God to live. And what I love about scientists is that they're mature enough to see that, because it's true for every domain. And specifically for investors and TTOs, I don't know, kill them all maybe? I don't know, wait for them to retire. I guess that's the most promising direction, but that takes a while. If we succeed, it will take forever. That's a bad idea. Maybe let's not do any of this. But more realistically, I think that you need to be successful enough that they can't ignore you. So we see the biggest companies in the world are now using open source software on a daily basis. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that would be a weird thing that some people inside the organization would advocate for and everyone would just ignore. But open source software succeeded, right, with Linux, with the Python ecosystem. And at some point, everyone had to play ball because otherwise they were paying a large price. So the more decentralized science and decentralized ways of doing things and community-enabled ways of doing things succeed, the more they will be adopted by all of these stuffy old organizations. And the more we explain why the upside is unlimited and that's the right way to do things and bring evidence, the more I think this will get adopted. And otherwise, let's wait for them to die.
All right. Give me the optimist speaking.
Yes. You know, it's a hard question, and I don't know if we should limit it to specific stakeholders, or if we should think about this whole market structure in terms of a multi-stakeholder system, and then from there, you know, dive a little bit into what might be the most either vulnerable parts or vulnerable stakeholders. That's probably patients. Then there might be a second question that's, where is value or rent extracted in a very unhealthy, in an unhealthy way, because that's where the market pressure is, and that's what we've seen in other areas as well. And this whole theme of the creator economy that is currently, still in its very early days. If you look at music NFTs, for example, or programmatic art, that unleashed a whole wave of new business models and direct monetization models by cutting out intermediaries and have open source market coordination mechanisms, and you know, most of that stuff probably won't work in the midterm. These are big question marks, but some of it might, and I feel it's worthwhile to try it out in other fields and see what happens if we empower the creators of the scientific landscape by giving them much faster, more transparent, better access to funding, or give them faster, better access to data, or incentivize patients, for example, to share these data sets, and that I think will create a lot of pressure that will have an impact on various stakeholders. I'm not so concerned on the investor side. So for the early stage guys, you know, I'm not sure if we really want to onboard them, as that's competition and drives up prices and narratives. And for the later stage, as you said, you know, it's way more quantifiable numbers pointing up and right. It's a little bit of market sizing and different type of risk assessment. But yeah, I'd probably rather start on the productive parts of the ecosystem, because if they get something right, then the investors will follow. Yeah, but no easy answers for sure.
All right, we're going to do lightning round to keep this on time. So, a lot of macro environment changes over the last few weeks. There's founders in the room here probably thinking about raising or going out to do their new venture or seeking out some money. Couple quick thoughts from everyone, 1 minute tops on macro environment and what you're thinking about in terms of how that affects the venture raise.
Yeah, there's a lot written and a lot said out there, so I would read widely. Like, there's a lot of hot takes and reasonable takes, and I think all of them are data points that founders should integrate. I think my opinion is at the earliest stages, where everyone in this room building something is at that early stage, it really doesn't matter to some degree. I would say the only thing that matters is, focus, execution, measuring against your KPIs and OKRs are always important at the early stages, and now increasingly so. So I would just say you certainly don't want to be head in the sand, not paying attention to the macro, but to some degree you still want to be heads down, executing, focus, essentially staying true to your mission and just executing against what you see as the key things before you. To a certain degree, it's impossible to predict the macro environment a year from now, let alone 5 years from now. So that's not super helpful, but how I think about it.
No, it's helpful, yeah. The money, I think, for early stage is there. I think it raises the bar of focus on the quality of storytelling, and obviously, why are you in this, and are you going to be in this for the next year or two or 3 or 5, or 10 years, and you should be in it for 10 years. because it's not, the environment will select out the people who are not doing it for the right reasons, because it's not always going to be as pleasant. But if you're in it for the right reasons, and if you can motivate your team, and if you can build, and if you are willing to learn and adjust, you're going to be fine. This is,
Just like you said, I mean, if you're in this room, I think you've already done something right. Because what you don't want to do over the next year, if the macro environment proceeds the way, in the pessimistic direction, is to try to sell things to people, especially to corporates. Don't do that. But creating community, creating an open ecosystem, creating something that brings value to people, and hopefully creating something that people don't have to pay for, and yet you're collecting evidence that it's valuable and that it will eventually be profitable, I think is the right direction. And the other thing is, make sure you're working on something you're very, very passionate about, because you're going to be doing it for a while. But again, I think for this room, just find out what you're passionate about, make sure you bring value to people, and that's about it.
Yeah.
It's sad that there's so much consensus on this topic. I'd say if you already started a company, make sure, or project, make sure you're well enough capitalized for the next 24 months. Stretch out your runway. If you're about to start a company, I feel there's barely a better time than in bear markets. I started my own firm in the middle of the darkest bear market. It wasn't easy at all. It took me 2 years to get from zero to somewhere. But it's a very high kind of a social signal and selection. So whenever you reach out to venture funds now, there's a much better noise to signal ratio. You'll have way more authenticity if you're really working on a problem you deeply care about. And then if you raise now, typically you get finance for the next 18 to 24 months as a rule of thumb, and should not be affected even in the more, say, sinister scenarios that might lie ahead. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's not just not too bad of a time to raise. I think it's almost the best time to start a company right now.
All right, so ending just on time. Thanks, guys. This has been super fun. A couple of summary items for folks who joined us late. I think, we're all very bullish on DeSci, that's why we're here, but we're so early innings, right? And so the folks on the stage here, there's about, 2 or 3x of other investors who are in the space, but in 5 years, I bet there's going to be 5 to 10x other people in the space, right? That's longevity that we're talking about here. I think the second point we all, consensus was that the trend is going to be in favor of open source, and that means bring, as you said, Alex, multi-stakeholders. So let's not be too binary on, just the folks that are, the technology licensing offices and biotech VCs. There's so many other people, including patients. I'm glad you brought that up. That are so important to bring into the space as we develop it further. Look, as we just talked about, the macro environment is challenging, but I agree, pre-seed and seed, this is the best time to be starting a company. And I like your point, on the signal, the noise value signals is going to be a lot more important when you talk to VCs. To those starting a company, good luck, and we're looking forward to talking to you, and we're happy to chat after the panel right now. So thanks, everyone.